So good morning, everyone. Um, First of all, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us this morning, and especially on a Saturday morning for Bregando with Disaster, Post-Hurricane Maria Realities and Resiliencies. My name's Leslie Alsasser, and I'm the Curator of Education at the Contemporary Art Museum on the USF campus. Before we begin, we'd like to thank the generous support from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Florida Department of State, Florida Humanities, the Tampa Bay Rays, and the Rowdies, and the USF Institute of the Study of Latin American and Caribbean, and the USF College of Art, who helped us make the symposium a reality. The symposium is presented as part of an outreach and educational events for the exhibition Constant Storm, Art from Puerto Rico and the Diaspora, which is currently on view at the USF Contemporary Art Museum on the Tampa campus. Constant Storm, curated by Noelle Smith and Christian Viveros-Fonet, gathers together recent art by contemporary Puerto Rican artists who work on and away from Puerto Rico. It includes drawing, painting, sculpture, photography, video, installation, and socially engaged practice. The hinge upon which Constant Storm turns is the passage of Hurricane Maria, which devastated the islands of the Northeast Caribbean with Category 5 winds on September 20th, 2017. Faced with the greatest natural catastrophe in their history, Puerto Ricans found themselves bregando, dealing with a host of disasters after the disaster, with scant assistance from the US. In works that range from joyous to somber, the artists celebrate their culture while recognizing the pervasive problems that have been exacerbated by the devastating storm. These problems include immigration, the legacy of colonialism, US domination, emphasis on the service economy, a threatened environment, racism and shifting identities, the loss of traditional ways of life, and much more. The artworks that animate Constant Storm are records of a true constant storm. Today, through current scholarship, works of art, and personal experience, the symposium will provide a broader understanding of what it means to be bregar with the constant storm experienced by Puerto Ricans in both Puerto Rico and in the Floridian diaspora. In the best of times, hurricanes beget wreckage and ruin. Hurricane Maria certainly wrought widespread devastation and misery, but it also highlighted and exacerbated endemic situations affecting health, migration, economics, and politics. Today, panelists will give voice to these endemic situations and include scholars in the fields of sociology, anthropology, and political science from Florida universities, contemporary Puerto Rican artists from the exhibition Constant Storm, and the student perspective from the Floridian diaspora. We are deeply, deeply grateful to the panelists for sharing their scholarship, their artistic practice, and their student experience. We extend a special, heartfelt thank you to Dr. Alessandra Rosa from the USF Sociology Department, who collaborated on every aspect of the symposium, and through her own scholarship, her enthusiasm, and her vast network of colleagues helped assemble this extraordinary panel. Briefly, I'll tell you the symposium is divided into 3 sections. The morning panel, Entanglements of Disaster, will end at 12:15. We'll break for lunch, and during lunch, if anyone would like to join me for a virtual brown bag lunch tour, I'll lead a tour of Constant Storm between 1 and 2. And then the afternoon panel will reconvene at 2:15 for the politics of disaster. So, without further ado, I want to welcome you again, and I would like to introduce Noelle Smith. Noelle Smith is our former Deputy Director of the USF Contemporary Art Museum. She's a curator of Caribbean and Latin American art, and she's one of the 2 curators of Constant Storm, Art from Puerto Rico and the Diaspora. She's also today's symposium moderator. Join me in welcoming Noelle Smith.
Well, thank you, Leslie, for that beautiful introduction to the exhibition. And I would like to reiterate all the thanks to everyone who's participated in the panel, especially to Alessandra. But I'd also like to very much thank the artists who have formed part of this really kind of a landmark exhibition. They all say nobody's doing this type of exhibition, collective exhibition of Puerto Rican artists, contemporary Puerto Rican artists. So I hope you get a chance to come visit us at the museum. If not, at usf.cam, you can see very extensive documentation. Right behind me is a work by Angel Otero, an artist based in New York, Brooklyn. And this is a work called September Elegy that clearly references the devastation, both emotional and material, that the hurricane wrought. There are many, many other very interesting, beautifully realized works in the show. And apart from their technical brilliance and aesthetic brilliance, they are all very much grounded in concerns about Puerto Rico, its history, its future, its actuality. So it's so important to drill down with noted scholars from universities all over Florida to elaborate on these themes and to give us a little bit of a fuller picture. I'm very, very grateful for all of you for joining us today. I think this really shows what a university can do in terms of serving its community, all of its community. So without further ado, I would like to now start the symposium. Our first presenter is Dr. Alessandra Rosa, and her presentation, which is co-authored, is titled Cascading Disasters, the Impact of Hurricane Maria and COVID-19 on Puerto Rican Post-Disaster Migrants, Adaptation and Integration in the Tampa Bay Area. And it is co-authored by Rebecca Blackwell, Elizabeth Aranda, Melanie Escue, and Alessandra Rosa. Dr. Alessandra Rosa is a sociocultural anthropologist, professor, researcher, activist, public speaker, and consultant. Currently, she is a visiting instructor in the Department of Sociology at the University of South Florida. Previously, she was a postdoctoral scholar here working with Dr. Elizabeth Aranda on a National Science Foundation grant about the experiences of Puerto Ricans who migrated to the United States after Hurricane Irma and Maria, to understand the challenges or opportunities they have faced since they arrived to Central Florida. Prior to coming to USF, she was an assistant professor at Lynn University and a visiting instructor at Florida International University. Her areas of expertise include social movements, digital activism, education, Latin America and Caribbean studies, with a focus on Puerto Rican studies, women, and gender studies, post-disaster migration studies, emotional well-being, and media discourse analysis. As a transnational feminist scholar, she has dedicated her teaching, research, and service to fostering diversity, equity, and justice. Her work has been published in academic journals, electronic journals, book chapters, as well as non-academic outlets. Her book transcript is soon to be published with the University of Nebraska Press. Please welcome Alessandra Rosa. Thank you.
Hello. So as Noelle just introduced, this research that I'm going to be presenting is a team project that we did funded by the NSF, National Science Foundation, and in collaboration with the nonprofit organization Mujeres Restauradas por Dios. It is titled Cascading Disasters, the Impact of Hurricane Maria particularly, and COVID-19 on Puerto Rican post-disaster migrants, adaptation and integration into the Tampa Bay area, right? And in this presentation, again, I'm going to be focusing more on the hardships that Puerto Rican post-disaster migrants encounter, but what we're discussing is in no way representative of the experience of all Puerto Rican post-disaster migrants. And I also want to give a little bit of a trigger warning that I'm about to start with a little video that might be, again, triggering for some people, right? So here we go. So as you can tell, this is one of our participants' video that he wanted to share with us. That was the front of his house in Puerto Rico when hurricane happened. It broke the garage door, and you can see everything was flooded, even inside the house, right? So this is part of the trauma that we're going to be dealing with, right? As we encountered that they could not stay in that house, so they ended up having to migrate. So part of the purpose of our study was definitely to contribute really to the challenges and obstacles that Puerto Rican post-disaster migrants confronted once they had to migrate, and in a way are still confronting, right, in the Tampa Bay area. Similarly, we wanted to connect them to available resources that provided support as they incorporated into this area. So with this in mind, our research question was, what does adaptation look like for Puerto Rican post-Hurricane Maria migrants? And how has the COVID-19 pandemic really shaped their incorporation processes, right? So how has the combination in a way of previous and new stresses really shaped the Puerto Rican post-disaster migrants adaptation process into the Tampa Bay area, right? So things that we were looking at, for example, we were looking at the literature that talked about this notion of pile-up effect, right? So you had existing vulnerabilities, and then you had the Hurricane Maria, and then you had migration, and then you had COVID-19, as you'll see in a little bit. So this notion that migration, because they weren't prepared to migrate, maybe some of them had thought about it at some point, but when they were impacted with the hurricane, they saw it as no choice. They had to leave, right? So it became this notion, the migration process became a secondary stressor. And it kind of, in a way, prolonged the trauma of the Hurricane Maria, what they had just experienced, right? When they came here, some of them experienced cultural, linguistic, and economic and other individual obstacles, right? So this definitely did not make the migration process easier. So we also looked at some of the literature from the risk reduction, right? Literature that focuses on the SHASM model. And as you can see, the name represents cascading hazards to disasters that are socially constructed, emerging out of social vulnerability. And why this one was so key for our research was precisely because, yes, in Puerto Rico, we were already experiencing an economic crisis, and there was individual existing vulnerabilities, right? The infrastructure was not the best one. And if you can imagine, when the hazard of Hurricane Maria, well, first Irma and then Maria, came back to back, that definitely exacerbated what already existed there, and the mismanagement, of course, of the government, both on a local and a national federal level, right? We had FEMA that had delays with food and water, or there was definitely like racialized neglect that Yarimal Bonilla talks about as well, in terms of the government and how they manage the resources, right? So with this literature and this model, we were able to really go into our data, and for the purpose of this presentation, though we use mixed method in our larger study, we're really focusing on the qualitative aspect for this presentation. So I'm looking at 54 in-depth interviews, which lasted from like 2 hours to almost 6 hours that we had to do in 2 days, right? In 2 sittings. And we also looked at, of course, the population is Puerto Rican post-Hurricane Maria migrants. And we know that there were some that could have also stayed a little bit longer. Then with the earthquakes, they ended up migrating as well. And again, it just exacerbated this notion of the cascading disaster or the pile-up effect, right? And we also looked at, again, this is a qualitative analysis, and it really involved this interactive analysis that is called grounded theory, where data and literature really have a discussion of seeing what's there and what comes out and what has been done and whatnot. So when we were doing this analysis, there were definitely 4 main themes that came out, and I'm going to go into them in a little bit. The first one was social ties, education, employment and stability, and the notion of compounding effects, right? It included the racialized neglect, hurricanes, migration process, and COVID-19. So going into the social ties, we saw that both the hurricane and the migration process really impacted social ties. And for most, it impacted them negatively in the sense that it did separate families, right? Those that stayed, those that came, or sometimes some were already here, but that doesn't necessarily, it helped a little bit, but it also brought on other stressors, right? And we also saw that social ties were impacted by COVID-19. So you're in a new place and it blunted that social integration process. You had to quarantine. You know, you even, as we'll see later on, maybe the ties that you were building with your neighbors or whatnot, it put a pause to it. And similarly, it did not help the nurturing of ties in Puerto Rico with those that stayed in the archipelago, right? So we have a quote, for example, of Yanira, and she was heartbroken when she had plans to go to Puerto Rico in March. I said to my grandparents, I'm sorry, I know I've not seen you for 2 years, but for now, we cannot go there. So that was one of the hardest things for us during the beginning of COVID. You know, a lot of people had plans. Those trips back and forth to Puerto Rico definitely helped in the adaptation and integration process here. And that was definitely put on pause for some people because of COVID. Similarly, we look at the education process. And here we see that the hurricane definitely interrupted educational attainment, whether it was individual or for their children. You know, we had participants that cannot speak English well enough to be able to help their children, you know, go online and practice what they need to be taught. So they felt this really like stuck, kind of like, I need to work, but I also need to try to help out and best that I can for the education of my children. We also see the migration, again, the notion of education barriers. Yes, it did have some opportunities, but the notion, again, of English language, or some people might not have computers for all the kids that they needed to connect virtually, and some had to use their smartphones, and that is not always the easiest way to connect and to do even a presentation, right? So we also see that COVID-19, in terms of education, again, the quality that the children were getting was definitely exacerbated the pre-existing vulnerabilities. And as I mentioned, not knowing English well. And in this case, we have a quote from Manuel that he was actually, when the hurricane happened, I was in the middle of studying to finish my bachelor's. Right now with COVID-19, it's so difficult to make money that I prefer to be working as much as I can than studying, right? He's the adult, he's the father, he has kids and a family. So he had to put his studies on pause to be able to make money to survive the COVID pandemic, right? So then this really ties in well with the other finding that we saw, the notion of employment and stability. And for many, again, the hurricane brought a loss of belongings, home, employment, and they had to start from scratch here. And the migration process, again, brought employment barriers. You know, there was a big sense of loss of capital. It made getting employment very difficult. Again, we were in the middle of a pandemic. Many hours were cut, as you'll see that COVID-19 did, or they were fired. They could not find jobs. So it was definitely the context of an adaptation struggle, even after all that they had just gone through, right? So here we have a quote by Nando, and he was telling us that I was working maintenance at the mall, cleaning machines with the pressure washer. They ended up cutting my hours, and for a long time, like 4 months, I was without a job. Then they called, but the schedule they wanted to give me was impossible for me. So I couldn't go back there. Some months after, I ended up in another job where things aren't going so great. I work in a lid packaging factory. Someone has to do it. So again, even the notion of what types of jobs were available that they were accepting in the middle of the pandemic definitely impacted, right, their adaptation and integration into the Tampa Bay area. So the stability was again lost. So then the final finding that we are highlighting in this presentation is the notion of compounding effect. So you can definitely see this notion that the hurricane as a related disaster, as a natural hazard, definitely brought a big sense of trauma, which was, again, exacerbated with the migration process as a secondary stressor and everything that was brought into that, which again made it worse with the notion of the public health crisis before even being able to fully recover. So is, again, the pileup effect and this compounding effect that most of our participants felt, right? So we have this quote by Lily that is highlighting, in Puerto Rico, my nephew's wife died from COVID, and my nephew has COVID, and his daughter, her children too, and they're all locked up there. They're locked up. You relieve those moments, and it feels like it was happening like right now. It's like a movie, seeing it all over again. It's been 3 years now, and my son still has a blue roof. He hasn't been able to do much. Now with this pandemic, the jobs are very limited, right? So you can definitely see through her, not only were her social ties affected, her son hasn't been able, economic and stability, and definitely this notion of the pileup, right? With the impact of COVID, having people close to her died and being affected, and the fact that she keeps reliving the trauma of the hurricane every time the day comes around, like we just passed it recently. So in conclusion, we have this notion of COVID-19 definitely interrupted or stalled the socioeconomic integration for Puerto Rican post-disaster migrants in what we're calling cascading disasters, right? And our study really highlights the importance of developing strategies that can promote not only resiliency, but also mitigation and prevention of crisis. And of course, we know the pandemic affected everybody, but again, it's the notion of the pileup effect, particularly on our population that we're focusing. So, Thank you very much. And you can feel free to contact us if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and to your co-authors as well for this wonderful presentation. I'd like to mention before we move on to Dr. Duany that we welcome your comments and your questions. You can tune in here to chat or Q&A and put in your questions. After the last presentation this morning, we will entertain questions. We're also going to welcome panelist interaction with conversation afterwards as well. So please send us your questions and your comments, and would love to hear from you. So right now, I would like to introduce our second panelist. This is Dr. Jorge Duany, in a presentation called Rethinking Puerto Rican Migrants as Climate Refugees. Dr. Jorge Duany is the director of the Cuban Research Institute and professor of anthropology at Florida International University in Miami. Born in Cuba and raised in Panama and Puerto Rico, Dr. Duany previously served as acting dean of the College of Social Sciences and professor of anthropology at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. He has held visiting research positions, research and teaching appointments at several US universities, including Harvard, Wisconsin, Florida, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. He earned his PhD in Latin American Studies, specializing in anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. He also holds an MA in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago and a BA in Psychology from Columbia University. Dr. Duany has published extensively on migration, ethnicity, race, nationalism, and transnationalism in Cuba, the Caribbean, and the United States. He is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 22 books, including the following titles: Obra in 2021, Puerto Rico, What Everyone Needs to Know, Blurred Borders, Transnational Migration Between the Hispanic Caribbean and the United States, and the Puerto Rican Nation on the Move, Identities on the Island and in the United States. Please welcome Dr. Jorge Duany.
Thank you, Nicole. And I also want to thank my colleague and friend, Elizabeth Aranda, for inviting me to this symposium, as well as recognize my very first student at FIU in the Department of Sociocultural and Global Sociocultural Studies, Alessandra Rosa. And I look forward to our conversation together. So I'm going to talk about the issue of how and to what extent Puerto Ricans who came after Maria, and to a lesser extent after Irma, are different from previous and perhaps even post Maria migrants in ways that are related, I think, to the issue of climate migration. I don't know if, here we go. Okay, so now you can see the full screen. And it's something that I've been thinking about for the past few years. I've been studying Puerto Rican migration to Florida and to the US for a long time. But in 2017, something really different seems to have happened. So the question is how these post-Maria refugees differ from previous refugees. So before I focus on the Puerto Rican situation, I want to review briefly what people mean by climate refugees, which is actually a contested definition, and there's no really generally accepted definition. Even the term refugee seems problematic in this case, so that's why I'm putting it in quotation marks. But I do think that applying this discussion to the case of Puerto Rican migrations after Maria is productive. So then, sort of drawing on some of the information that Alessandra already covered, I want to review what the impact of Hurricane Maria was, particularly on the Puerto Rican exodus in 2017, and then show you some statistical information that suggests that people who came before and after Maria do have certain differences as well as some similarities. So what are climate refugees? The standard definition, I think, is the one that you see here. It's when people leave their home because of extreme weather events, such as hurricanes, and are forced to leave either temporarily or permanently because of either gradual or sudden changes in the environment. Examples would include, of course, hurricanes, drought, floods, and perhaps earthquakes. The one we're going to focus on are hurricanes, but I think, as Alexandra mentioned, the more recent earthquake situation in Puerto Rico also suggests that this will continue for some time. Another characteristic of so-called climate refugees is that contrary to regular migration, especially legal migration, there's a need for assistance by governments, receiving governments, to help with housing, job, and psychological adjustment as well. And then, as I already mentioned, it's common that some of these climate refugees do return home in the immediate or sort of medium-term future when things improve back home. And I think that there's some data, particularly for 2019 for Puerto Rico, that suggests that Puerto Ricans have been returning home in large numbers, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. So the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, I think, is well known for many of our attendees. It was the worst hurricane to hit Puerto Rico since San Felipe II in 1928. Although, by the way, the death toll of San Felipe was much higher, about 1,000 people, lower than Maria, as I'll mention in a second. The estimates vary as to what kind of damage Maria had in Puerto Rico, but the official estimate by the Puerto Rican government is $94 billion. The official toll, again, that has been contested. Some say higher, others in the beginning, especially the Puerto Rican government, said lower, but about 3,000 deaths have been documented. And what you see on the left is, as some of you may be familiar, was the very public mourning of those deaths in front of the Puerto Rican Capitol a few months after Maria. The effects of Maria on the infrastructure, particularly in the power grid, but also on the water service, the interruption of roads, and the destruction of bridges, as well as cell phones and communications, which were exasperating for relatives who wanted to communicate with their loved ones back home, was tremendous and lasted way too long. And finally, the most relevant aftermath of Hurricane Maria, again, depending on the sources, at least 130,000 people left Puerto Rico to the US mainland, to one of the 50 American states immediately afterwards, after 2017 and 19. So just a picture to illustrate some of those damages. Entire communities were wiped out, people lost their homes, and the sense of loneliness and isolation that I think are present in Alessandra and her colleagues' presentation can be captured in this particular picture from the San Isidro community near Caguas, I believe. And of course, this is the most infamous reminder of the slow and ineffective response by the federal government, particularly the White House. And this is the famous or infamous visit by President Trump throwing the paper towels at people in a Guaynabo church that was actually used by Puerto Rican politicians in the last elections to remind Puerto Ricans in Orlando who they should be voting for if they think that President Trump did not do a good job. Now, contrary to the government response, both by the federal government as well as the Commonwealth government, there has been a lot of documentation of the very vibrant community response. I know resilience is another topic for discussion. I know Yarimar Bonilla, who is on this call, has called this la maldita resiliencia, the damned resilience, because it has been used in various ways, especially by governments, to sort of pass on the responsibility of reconstructing and building their lives back after the hurricane. The one particularly good and, to me, exemplary case is the Centro de Apoyo de las Carolinas, which appears at one moment in the excellent documentary by Sonia Fritz, After Maria, The Two Shores, which, as you can see, if you read the Spanish, has done a tremendous job in terms of providing food for the community and other kinds of services like health clinics, educational workshops, and other activities. I understand that this mutual aid service is still functioning today. And again, is an example of the kind of self-help, homegrown initiatives that have proliferated throughout Puerto Rico. Also, if I remember correctly, in the documentary, the leaders of the project mentioned at one point that they took over the school, which had been abandoned, and then simply broke the entrance and took over. So again, it's an example of the kind of initiative that, just one example, that has taken place in Puerto Rico since the hurricane. More relevant to this panel has been the emergence and reemergence of artistic projects like this one in Yauco, which involves painting the houses this is from a year after Hurricane Maria. And even though some houses, again, have those blue roofs that Alessandra mentioned, the sense at least that people are taking charge of their destinies and improving their living conditions by using colors and public art is quite striking. Now, the response to Maria right after the hurricane took over in October was quite dramatic. And one Univision survey, among others, did document the very strong desire or the necessity to leave Puerto Rico among the majority of people who were considering leaving just a month afterwards. And in fact, the other question was, would these people return to live in Puerto Rico? And more than half said that they wouldn't. So again, the sense of urgency and the idea that migration has historically happened in Puerto Rico was one of the ways of coping with the disaster. But at the same time, I would argue, as I'll show you in a moment, that there has been a mass return movement after Maria, and will probably continue if the current trend persists. Another indicator of the huge number of people who were displaced by Maria is an official tally of passengers arriving in Florida from Puerto Rico. These are not all migrants. It's simply people who came once the airports were open to Miami, Orlando, and Fort Lauderdale. And notice that the number of people leaving the island almost reached 400,000 people. So again, it's unprecedented. We don't know exactly how many of these people were technically migrants, how many returned to the island, how many moved on to other places like New York and other diaspora communities. But certainly there was a massive outpour of people immediately after the hurricane. Interestingly, as opposed to the federal government incompetent response to Maria, and also the local governments in Puerto Rico, I mean the cities and municipios, Governor Rick Scott, who took advantage of this opportunity to campaign among Puerto Ricans, and certainly this campaign seems to have been effective. He was elected senator with strong support from the Puerto Rican community in the Orlando area, established this multidisciplinary welcoming center in Orlando, in which people were able to get driver's licenses and other kinds of immediate support, relocation support right upon arriving in Orlando. Similar operations took place in Miami. And I also want to remind the audience that one of the first groups of people from Puerto Rico to be displaced were of course, older people and people who were sick and otherwise vulnerable. This is one lady who arrived very quickly to Fort Lauderdale. I think it was right before the hurricane. And others, in particular, dialysis patients who were relocated, in fact, temporarily in my university in Miami, Florida International University. About 90 of them came from both Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands because, of course, the interruption of power on the island made it very difficult, if not impossible, for them to receive their treatment. So this is one sector of the population that comes to mind in trying to understand how the post-Maria migrants differed from previous and later migrants today. A second group, of course, were K-12 students who enrolled in Florida public schools. Estimates range from 10,000 to 11,000 in that first year, right after the hurricane. And of course, the Orange County and Osceola counties in Central Florida were the ones that absorbed the largest number of them, but also students in the Tampa area, in Miami, and other large counties in Florida. And relevant to this presentation and to the public universities in Puerto Rico, there was a significant number of displaced Puerto Rican students who enrolled in places like FIU, USF, UCF, UF, and they were given an exemption from state tuition for a couple of years so that they could continue their studies here in Florida. Now, looking at the overall numbers of Puerto Rican migration to Florida, I decided to start with 2005, right before the economic recession began in Puerto Rico. And here you see the Florida, this is the purple area is the ones who came to Florida. And you can see there has been a steady increase since 2005 in the number of Puerto Rican migrants to Florida, reaching the high number of close to 50,000 in 2017-18, a year after Maria. And similarly, the pattern, although much larger scale, is repeated for the entire United States, reaching again that high point of more than 130,000 according to census data. And so what we see here in this chart is, first of all, how Florida, and particularly Central Florida, has continued to attract the largest number of Puerto Rican migrants, both before and after Maria, and the record-breaking figures of Puerto Rican migration to the United States, which have, of course, surpassed even the so-called Great Migration of the 1950s, when more than 500,000 Puerto Ricans were leaving the island. When you add up all of these numbers, in fact, you get something like 700,000 Puerto Ricans who migrated to the United States during this, during the last decade, in fact. And as many of you know, during the last decade, from 2010 to 2020, Puerto Rico lost quite a significant percentage of its population, mostly due to outmigration. Now, in this chart, I compiled the available data, again, based on census data from the Instituto de Estadísticas in Puerto Rico, year by year. And I found a couple of patterns that I wanted to underline. First of all, the migrant flow has been progressively aging since 2015 and has now reached about 31 years of age, which is, again, quite high for migration flow that is mostly composed of workers. And that's significant, especially after 2017, when for the first time, Puerto Ricans had a median age of 30. The gender composition of the Puerto Rican migration is also changing. And as you can see from the beginning of the period in which men predominated, now it's women. So 54%, if you read the statistic another way, of 2019 migrants were women. Never married also reached a high in 2017 and has declined somewhat in the last couple of years. And of course, it's still too early perhaps to see whether this is a long-term pattern or not, but we see some changes there. And with regard to education, I don't see a tremendous change here. It's roughly people who do have more than half a high school education or more. And if you look at the occupational composition of the migrants, there has been a significant shift, especially in 2017. We see an increase in the number of managers and professionals, and that has remained until 2019. So it appears that those who were able to leave Puerto Rico, especially in the aftermath of Maria, were those who had more resources, had more skills, perhaps also spoke English better. With regard to median income, there are ups and downs. And as you can see, 2017 was a year in which the median income was lowest, except for 2015. And then in 2019, that figure also dropped. So overall, I think there's sufficient statistical evidence available to suggest that Puerto Rican migrants have been changing after Maria. And again, that reminds me of the major question that I raised at the beginning, which is to what extent climate refugees differ from other kinds of migrants. And I also want to end then beyond the statistics on some of those issues, psychological and otherwise, that also were mentioned before: the loss of material and emotional attachments, houses, especially, but also other kinds of symbolic objects, erosion of communities and sense of place, like the picture that I showed before, in which entire neighborhoods were eliminated and slowly reconstructed. On the positive side, again, how Puerto Ricans on a daily basis relied on each other, on their neighbors, their friends, their families, both close and abroad. And one of the common results of Hurricane Maria, as documented by Elizabeth Aranda, Alessandra Rosa, as well as the excellent compilation of stories by Maria Padilla and Nancy Rosado on survivors of the storm, was that they lost their trust of the government, both the federal government as well as the local government, as you can see from this sort of small image of those blue roofs that still dot the Puerto Rican landscape after 4 years of Maria. The sense of marginality, isolation, loneliness, stress, not being able to communicate in some cases in Orlando, in Tampa, Miami, and far away places as well, is something that needs to be studied and addressed by academic and community organizations. And finally, the very high rate of post-traumatic stress disorder, especially among young children who were taken from their regular routines and then started new schools in a strange environment. That seems to be one of the long-term results of Hurricane Maria. So to conclude, I do want to suggest that Puerto Ricans are in many ways sort of classical climate refugees in some of the characteristics that I've already discussed. So the sudden nature of the migration, the broad selection of people, particularly elderly, infirm, sick, and very young children who were displaced suddenly from their natural environments. And I do believe from the data that I discussed before that Hurricane Maria served something of a high point or a low point, if you will, in the long-term history of the Puerto Rican diaspora that, as you know, dates back at least to the mid-20th century and is continuing today. The migrant flow from Puerto Rico seems to have changed significantly after 2017 in terms of occupation, age, gender, and other characteristics that should be followed up. And finally, I wanted to end on this point that even 4 years after Hurricane Maria, we still see some of these traumatic effects that have not been addressed. Some of it has to do with the slow recovery of the Puerto Rican economy, the fact that, as was mentioned before, Puerto Rico has been neglected compared to other places like Florida or Texas that have suffered similar disasters. And again, the broader picture of inequality and the lack of access to US citizenship rights for people who are based in Puerto Rico. So I'll leave it at that, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge, for that very interesting and insightful presentation. Our final presentation this morning is a dual presentation by two of the artists who are included in Constant Storm, Sofía Gallisá Muriente and Natalia Lassalle-Morillo. I have to say that this is a project that is very, very close to my heart, and it's just an extraordinary work of art. So I hope that you get a chance to see it. So Sofía Gallisá Muriente is a Puerto Rican visual artist. Through multiple approaches to documentation, her work deepens the subjectivity of historical narratives and examines formal and informal archives, popular imaginaries, and visual culture. She studied film and TV production and Latin American studies at New York University and has participated in experimental pedagogical platforms led by artists like Anuak School and Beta Locals La Práctica, substituting graduate studies with the process of learning and unlearning with others. She has been a resident artist of Museo La Ena in Argentina, Alice Yard, Trinidad and Tobago, Solad in Tenerife, and Catapult as well as a fellow of the Flaherty Seminar and the Smithsonian Institute. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Art in America, Terremoto, and Hyperallergenic, and earned her grants from Teorica and NALAC. She is exhibited in the Whitney Biennial, the Queen's Museum, IFA Gallery in Berlin, Malba in Argentina, and CCA Glasgow, and Puerto Rican galleries like Kilómetro 02, El Lobby, Diagonal, and Embajada. From 2014 to 2020, she was co-director of the artist-run nonprofit organization Beta Local, dedicated to fostering knowledge exchange and transdisciplinary practices in Puerto Rico. She is currently a fellow of the Puerto Rican Arts Initiative and the Annenberg Innovation Lab at USC. Natalia Lassalle-Morillo is a theater director, filmmaker, performer, visual artist, and educator whose work reconstructs history through a transdisciplinary approach to research, form, and narrative, melding theatrical performance, intuitive experimental ethnography, and collaborations with non-trained performers. Natalia's practice centers on excavating imagined and archived history, redirecting canonical narratives through embodied reenactments, and challenging the prioritization of written history by foregrounding instead the creation of new mythologies. Her methodologies seek to redefine how performance and film are created and examine how the event of spectating embodied narratives is influenced by the sociopolitical, geographical, and metaphysical context where it is presented. She earned an MFA in directing from California Institute of the Arts and a BFA in drama from Experimental Theater Wing at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. Her work is part of the CADIS collection, and she has been a residence artist at the Fonderie Darling in Montreal, Miami Light Project, Beta Local, and Convent in Catalonia, Spain. She is a 2021 Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow and will be part of Amant Foundation's inaugural residency program in 2022. She has lived and worked in Montreal, Miami, New York, and Germany, but is currently based in Bayamon, Puerto Rico. Welcome, Sofía and Natalia.
Hello, and thank you for that presentation. It's really, we're really honored to be a part of this symposium and obviously also part of this exhibition, and want to first of all thank again Noelle Smith for your invitation to be a part of this project almost 3 years ago, and for all the great conversations that we've had throughout that process. And we also wanted to make space in this event particularly to say thank you to Dr. Alessandra Rosa and Dr. Jorge Duany, who you were honored to be in conversation with in this event and who have been in conversation with us previously as part of the process of developing the work that we produced for this exhibition. And so it's really kind of like a wonderful end to the cycle to be in conversation again now with this finished work. The work that Natalia and I produced that was commissioned by USF for this exhibition is titled Foreign in a Domestic Sense, which obviously is a direct quote, or let's say a borrowing a term from the United States Supreme Court in one of the definitions that they have given to the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. This one is as part of the insular cases. And foreign in the domestic sense is not just one of these very kind of absurd or contradictory phrases that has been used to describe this limbo status of Puerto Rico. But we also felt like it was a phrase that spoke in different ways to how we understood the experience of migration, of foreignness, and of otherness, and also how we, in our process of developing this piece, wanted to relate to, you know, to the project and to the people that we met along the way. We can speak a little bit more about the title further on, but I wanted to just to start us off by explaining a little bit about our process. Natalia and I, you know, have been working on this for quite a while now, at least about 2 years, and we have been in dialogue for longer, particularly because we were both interested in spending time in emerging Puerto Rican communities throughout Central Florida, getting to know people and listening to their stories and their experiences, and gaining a better understanding of the ways in which Puerto Rican identity was somewhat being reshaped or recreated in Florida, in these communities. The opportunity to be a part of this exhibition also allowed us to focus it on recent migration to Florida, driven both by the economic crisis and the Fiscal Control Board, and in more recent years, obviously by Hurricane Maria and other disasters. And so we undertook a very long process of interviews and reached out to people using our own social networks, also using references from folks like Dr. Alessandra Rosa, who connected us, for example, with Mujeres Restauradas por Dios. And you know, we speak about this project as a constellation of stories and of experiences of Puerto Ricans in Florida, because from the get-go, you know, from the very, very beginning of this project, we were very aware that we were not making a documentary project that was going to be able to encompass the complexity of the reality of Puerto Ricans in Florida. And we wanted to kind of work from that place of let's say, humility or recognition of our limitations, and figure out other ways in which we could approach and engage with these experiences, understanding their broad range, also understanding that we were only going to be able to spend a limited amount of time traveling around Florida. But we, like I was saying, undertook a very, very long process of interviews, and then spent about a month filming throughout Central Florida and meeting even more people. And the piece that we produced, which is this 4-channel video installation that's on view right now at the Contemporary Art Museum of USF, is a piece in 4 chapters, where each chapter in different ways attempts to produce a film about Puerto Ricans in Florida. Let's say that they're in like different attempts at making that film, or playing with ideas around how one could visually tell these stories and accompany these stories. And I think, you know, it was very important for us to also kind of expand or challenge the visual discourse that has accompanied the experience of Puerto Rican migration and the experience of Hurricane Maria, understanding that they've been events that have created, you know, unprecedented visibility for Puerto Rico, and an overabundance of image production, particularly from kind of an outside gaze, and particularly delving, you know, in a visual language that too often exploits misery and tragedy and destruction. And so we also wanted to listen to these stories that are indeed, many of them tragic and complicated and painful, but also spend time collecting images in these places throughout Central Florida, these stories, you know, where the people who told us these stories now live, to also find other ways of visualizing them and of accompanying them. And I'm sorry, I want to pass it on to Natalia so she can kind of complement a bit more on that introduction before we move on.
Yeah, but you did an amazing job. So I'll see what I can add. I mean, what I did want to add is that an important, you know, as Sofía said, we've spent almost 3 years working and thinking and trying to figure out the most honest way to approach this project, because it became very clear to us from the beginning that we are entering a space. We both have different relationships to Florida. I think my initial interest came from the fact that I lived in Florida for almost 5 years, but I lived in Miami. But in my transit as a person who lives in Puerto Rico, but also lives outside and is currently navigating this in between, I have developed a relationship to the term diaspora and thinking about how after the hurricane and after the accumulation of tragedies in the past couple of years, this, for me personally and creatively, this terminology has changed, and it has been redefined because we live in a country that lives outside of itself in many ways. So having this relationship to Florida already kind of created, for me at least, an entry point into thinking about Florida as this fertile land for new communities to emerge. And also, I think one of my initial interests came from a very personal and vulnerable place. I think after the hurricane, I would always have stopovers in Orlando, and I started talking to Sofía about how every time I had a layover in Orlando, I was shocked at how the Orlando airport felt like Puerto Rico. And I started having conversations with people that worked in the airport. And that's when I started, when I realized, oh, we need to come here and have contact with this community and really accept them as part of a larger Puerto Rican narrative. I think part of our methodology, as Sofía mentioned, was really working in complicity with the folks that we met. And complicity can be understood in different ways. We interviewed many folks who didn't end up in the film, but whose perspective and experiences of living and migrating to Florida really shaped the way that we saw Florida. And I feel that's an important point that I want to bring up as we see excerpts of the film, because it really did change the way that we saw the spaces. It really did become that we were taking these narratives and crafting a sort of script or a fragmented narrative, but the visuals that we filmed and we created were really created because we were able to see through their gaze. Also, an important part of this process really does come from a place of love for each other and our friendship, and an interest to meld our methodologies and learn from each other in the process of seeing a space together. There's so much more I can talk, but I think the best way to talk about this project is to show some of it. So we're going to be sharing, as Sofía said, the film is a 4-channel film installation in digital and Super 8 film. And it's 4 chapters. So we're going to be showing excerpts of each chapter and going deeper in each one of them.
Yes, I'm going to show a little bit of the first chapter, and then we'll continue speaking. Give me one moment. Sadly, I'm gonna have to speak over this so that we can continue to share our presentation while also watching this video. I wish we could show you all of it, but obviously our time is limited. But you know, I wanted to kind of let it run a little bit so that you understand that how this piece begins and how it combines different narratives of Puerto Ricans in Florida. Obviously, we begin with Angel Samalot, who is a Puerto Rican who we met, who worked at SpaceX. And the launch that you see in the upper left-hand corner is the last launch that he directed at SpaceX of a capsule to the International Space Station before recently moving back to Puerto Rico shortly after our interview with him. And we were really interested in this phenomenon of Puerto Ricans going to Florida to work at NASA and SpaceX, and how that has been a source of pride for so long, and how it somehow feels sometimes as if these are not just migrants, but ambassadors of Puerto Rico to space. And because we were also so interested in thinking about ways in which that migration to Puerto Rico points towards the future of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricanness, it was very important for us to speak to these Puerto Ricans who are traveling to space or dreaming of traveling to space actively. And again, I'm going to break down the images that you're seeing so you get a bit of a sense of how that came to be. Not only are we seeing his launch, but right now, for example, you're seeing images from a ride at Disney World that one of the Puerto Ricans who migrated to Florida after Maria used to work at, because we also spoke to a lot of Puerto Ricans who worked at Disney. And this mangrove forest that you're seeing right now is a place that Angel from SpaceX told us to visit because it's a mangrove forest adjacent to the launch pad for SpaceX and NASA. And he told us that it reminded him of Puerto Rico. You know, many people in our interviews mentioned places that they would go to when they felt nostalgic or that would remind them of home, that were portals in some way. And this was one of those places. We went to film the mangrove because it reminded Angel of home, and it was right next to the Kennedy Space Center. And while we were there, we got caught in a really heavy storm, which are some of the images that you're seeing now. And so between, and suddenly, this storm and this mangrove in Florida, accompanied very beautiful these testimonies about migrating to Florida in the midst of the hurricane. And so, this first chapter in many ways, it's about the journey. It's about, it's about that displacement and that transition and movement and it combines, it's trying to also kind of mix in imaginaries around, space and spaceships to, airplanes and travel, you know, from Puerto Rico to Florida, but also from Florida to space. You know, for us, I think La Guagua Aérea was also a very important reference. You know, it's a literary classic that speaks about the movement between Puerto Rico and New York, and it speaks of the airplane as a flying bus. And I think for me personally, one of the first things that made me interested in going to Florida to film was thinking about, you know, wondering about what that new Guagua Aérea looks like. And here towards the end, you know, we're listening to Nancy Hernandez, and these are images from Mujeres Restauradas por Dios, which Alessandra might recognize, since you know, she was the one who put us in touch and who spoke to us first about her work with Puerto Rican families after Maria who had migrated. And so I'll pass it on to Natalia for chapter 2.
So should we watch it first, maybe?
Sure, however you want.
You can watch a little bit of it, and then I can maybe give some context. Is the sound on?
Oh, sorry, no.
Great. So maybe we can return on. Yes, thank you, Sofía. So yeah, the second chapter, we named it Portals to Puerto Rico. And one of the recurring themes in our interviews was the nostalgia that many of the folks we spoke to had towards Puerto Rico. And we started asking them about spaces that reminded them of home. And many, we had a myriad of responses. Many of them were businesses, celebrations, food, churches, restaurants, bakeries, supermarkets, karaoke nights. We even ended up going to a toque de bomba in somebody's house. But we really started thinking about how all of these encounters, spaces, and businesses become portals for Puerto Ricans to transport themselves back to Puerto Rico when they are in Florida. Some of the images that you saw in the excerpt that we just watched, the first part, which is, you see sort of these shots, panning shots, are in a road that Sofía and I encountered driving through Florida, because that's a lot of what we did, was just drive around and see what caught our attention. And there was this road called Boricua Drive. And we decided to go and film it. But what we encountered there was that there was like an intersection of spaces in that same space that, you know, felt like Boricua Drive, but also reminded us of home. And then towards the end of that section, you see this motorcycle club that we encountered in a karaoke night that we don't get to see in the excerpt that we showed, but there was this place called Cerveza House that some people had mentioned to us that we should go visit because it was like the quintessential Puerto Rican bar. And we ended up in this karaoke bar, which is also something that personally reminds me of home, because I feel karaoke is a big thing in Puerto Rico as well. But this chapter continues into this toque de bomba that we carried out in Mari's house, who has a bomba group in Tampa. And it actually culminates in one of the Ricky Renuncia protests in Orlando. And in this beautiful moment of silence that took place in the protest, with everybody holding up their phones, the light of their phones.
And we should say perhaps that that footage of the Ricky Renuncia protest was given to us by Manuel Deschamps, one of the people who we connected with, who was a part of Body Squad, which was a group of, you know, a very, a coalition more of people and from different organizations and backgrounds who created this group to organize protests in synchrony with the Ricky Renuncia protests. And so, you know, that's also comes from very much from that complicity that we were talking about earlier. I'm gonna pass it on to chapter 3. Let me see. Again. And just in case there's any doubts, you know, we're not listening to the voices of the testimonies. We are just reading them. So make sure to watch closely.
Ladies and gentlemen, our time trials have been momentarily delayed. Please remain seated. Your time machine vehicle will begin moving again at any moment. Please remain seated. We'll resume our journey shortly. Thank you.
again, I'm gonna lower the volume on the beautiful, crazy sound mix designed by Daria Morales. So I can explain some of this to you and speak a little bit more about this footage. Disney World was really an important topic for us. I had the fortune of talking to Jorge Duany very early in this project and learning about, learning from him about how Disney drove one of the first waves of Puerto Rican migration to Florida, both, not just for work, but also, because of the housing bubble created by Disney. But I think that to this day, Disney continues to play a really large role in Puerto Ricans' imaginaries of Florida and of the United States. And many, many Puerto Ricans work at Disney, which was also really important for us to consider and think about in relationship to Maria migration and in relationship to a lot of other things. And so this footage that you just saw starts with images shot while we went to Disney, and also high 8 footage of home movies shot by Natalia's family in the 90s when they traveled to Florida. But then we have this moment where kind of the form of this piece collapses, right? And we go into this Super 8 footage that you're watching now. And this Super 8 footage is footage that we shot this summer on Super 8. And then we hand developed in Puerto Rico to create different sorts of visual artifacts and to bring up more information on these images to kind of we kept talking through this process also about kind of trying to break the magic of Disney, right? Disney, one of the things that we learned from talking to Disney employees was about different terminology that Disney uses, and we were really interested in kind of appropriating some of these ideas for our piece. So for example, the way in which we chose to include the testimonies from the interviews that we show on screen, by having people's names and lines as dialogue, as written dialogue on the screen, comes from this notion that Disney refers to their employees as cast members, which was something that we thought was like very strange and sort of sinister when you think about it, to kind of camouflage labor relations in that way. And then another thing that different Disney employees spoke to us about was the idea of breaking the magic, and how part of their training is that, they're supposed to preserve the magic and not let the magic of Disney break, even though, as Lisbeth told us, the magic breaks every day. And so we wanted to create these breaks in the magic by also kind of playing with film formats, playing with disruption and sound, and different ways of going from a very pristine, high quality 4K digital video image, to these images that are more, let's say, dirtied and distorted by chemicals, by probably the minerals in the water that we use to develop even. And then this chapter ends with water kind of taking over, right? With nature taking over, because for us, this chapter is also about kind of the collapse of all of that built environments and human intervention and artifice that is so prevalent in Florida. We're really drawn to that contrast between artifice and kind of the Disneyfication of Florida, right? All of this built environment, and the contrast between that and nature, and how, throughout Florida, there's always, the presence of nature is always really felt, and not just any nature, but this kind of wilderness, this wilderness that has been kind of temporarily tamed to construct those built environments. And so, we joked around that we would constantly find ourselves filming pieces of swamps from parking lots of places, right? Like we would go into a business, and when we would park and get out of the car, we'd realize that there was like a little piece of swamp in the parking lot, or that in different ways, this kind of untamed nature was always lurking. And for us, it really also pointed towards the future, that presence of nature really pointed towards, the climate catastrophe that we're living through, and how, it's widely known that Florida is really threatened by that climate catastrophe as well. Not just, the only climate refugees aren't the Puerto Ricans coming from Maria to Florida, but certainly someday, perhaps all Floridians, or a great amount of Floridians, will also be climate refugees. And so this chapter closes with this line from Jezabel Roca Gonzalez, who's actually another one of the artists in the exhibition, and was a former student at USF. And they told us that, Florida is 20-something feet under sea level. Someday it'll be an island. And we thought this idea that, the future of Puerto Rico is in Florida, but the future of Florida is to be an island, was really resonated with us. And we really kind of wanted to, we ended up filming, so much of the presence of water in the state, both in contained and uncontained ways, right? So, fake artificial ponds that are built to manage flooding, as well as a place like the one that you're seeing now, which is King's Landing in Apopka, Florida, a really beautiful, beautiful natural reserve that we visited and filmed in. And so, yeah, so I think that in many ways, this third chapter is about kind of that future climate disaster. And it leads to the fourth chapter, which in many ways is the results, the aftermath. And I'll show you a little bit of it now. Perhaps, I know that we're running a little long on time, so I'll show you the beginning, and then perhaps Natalia can keep talking. But there's some very important quotes in this beginning that are really central to our thinking around this project.
I know we're running short on time, so I want to jump in and kind of give a bit of context. But this, this last chapter of the film, which is this first time we see bodies and people that, that are directed in space. It's called, We Still Don't Know, at least yet, How to Move Freely, which is a quote that we encountered, as we were filming in Florida, from dancing and performance theorist called Andrei Lebecki, who talks about how, in his essay, he really does talk about how choreopolitics define the way that we move around in space. And for us in this last chapter, I think a big reference that came up and that we were interested in working with was the Pulse shooting. We're thinking about the Pulse shooting as this first tragedy that made the Puerto Rican community visible, and how salsa night at a gay club is an emblematic kind of space that Puerto Ricans created to find community. And we were interested in working with Pulse, but then when we visited the memorial and spoke to family members and friends of survivors, we realized that there is a very problematic way of how the tragedy is being dealt with and manipulated, and how the narrative is resulting in this disnification of this very tragic event. So it pushed us away and really started thinking about ways to imagine community and ways to imagine this idea of this dance floor that brings people together. One thing that we realized what we realized quickly when we arrived in Florida is how the infrastructure of Florida and Orlando, and the fact that it's so spread out, conditions the way that the community interacts with itself. We realized in conversation with many of the Puerto Ricans who reside in Florida that they engage with community differently than the diasporas in New York do, because the fact that it is so spread out. So before going to Florida, we started thinking, what if we see Florida as this dance floor where everybody's trying to figure out a way to move around freely, and we're still trying to define, because this last wave of migration was so recent, that we're still trying to realize and figure out how to move together in the space. There were certain lines that were really crucial for us that we encountered later in the editing process, like Guillermo Rebollo Hill's line, the world in the colony is so tiny and beautiful and heartbreaking that it fits in the dance floor.
Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we have to end now.
Okay.
I really apologize. This is an incredible presentation, and thank you so much. And I hope that people will get a chance to see this. I've looked at it a couple of times. It's technically brilliant, but it's also emotionally very powerful. So I want to thank you so much for that. We have time for one question. And we do have a question for Dr. Duany from Yarimar Bonilla. And she wants to know, what role has the economic crisis played in the migratory shifts described? To what extent was displacement resilience already being normalized before Maria with the explosion of the debt crisis? And should we think of current migrants as austerity refugees as much or even more so than climate refugees?
Well, thank you, Yarimar, for the question, and of course that would require another presentation, which I'm not going to do. But I do think that it's appropriate to think about the cascading effects, as Alessandra called them in her presentation, of COVID, the economic crisis that has been ongoing for more than a decade, and all of these crises have made it extremely difficult for Puerto Ricans to survive on the island. And that's one of the reasons why there has been such a tremendous increase in the number of people leaving. On the other hand, I do think that there's something to be said. And again, I'm still sort of trying to think about this for the first time, that 2017 was a major turning point in the Puerto Rican diaspora that had begun earlier, particularly during the austerity crisis, and has continued since then. But the demographic profile, as well as the suffering and the stress that we have heard about that affected this particular group of people merit some distinction, analytical distinction, and then trying to understand the larger picture in which Puerto Rican is now, the Puerto Rican diaspora is now found.
Thank you. I was muted. I think that's one of the phrases that's going to last through the pandemic. You're on mute. Anyway, thank you everyone so much for your wonderful presentations. I'm sorry we didn't get to more questions. I can take some of these questions hopefully onto our second afternoon. We are going to break now. Leslie, for those who are interested, Leslie will be offering a tour of the exhibition. She does a great job. And then we will reconvene at 2:15.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Symposium, Bregando with Disaster, Post-Hurricane Maria Realities and Resiliencies. My name is Leslie Alsasser, and I am the Education Curator at the Contemporary Art Museum on the USF campus. We want to welcome you. We are so glad you're here. And if you were here this morning, welcome back. First, we would like to thank the generous support from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Florida Department of State, Florida Humanities, the Tampa Bay Rays and the Rowdies, and the USF Institute for Study of Latin America and the Caribbean, and the USF College of the Arts, who helped make the symposium a reality. The symposium is presented as part of the outreach and educational events for the exhibition Constant Storm, Art from Puerto Rico and the Diaspora, currently on view at the USF Contemporary Art Museum. Constant Storm, curated by Noelle Smith and Christian Viveros-Fonet, gathers together recent art by 12 contemporary Puerto Rican artists who work on or away from Puerto Rico. It includes drawing, painting, sculpture, photography, video, installation, and socially engaged practice. The hinge upon which Constant Storm turns is the passage of Hurricane Maria, which devastated the islands of the Northeast Caribbean with Category 5 winds on September 20th, 2017. Faced with this enormous natural catastrophe, Puerto Ricans found themselves bregando, dealing with a host of disasters after the disaster, with scant assistance from the US. In works that range from joyous to somber, the artists celebrate their culture while recognizing the pervasive problems that have been exacerbated by the devastating storm. These problems include emigration, the legacy of colonialism, US domination, emphasis on a service-based economy, a threatened environment, racism and shifting identities, the loss of traditional ways of life, and much more. The artworks that animate Constant Storm are truly records of a constant storm. Today and this afternoon, through current scholarship, works of art, personal experience, the symposium will provide a broader understanding of what it means to bregar, deal with constant storms experienced by Puerto Ricans in both Puerto Rico and the Floridian diaspora. In the best of times, hurricanes beget wreckage and ruin. Hurricane Maria certainly wrought widespread devastation and misery, but it also highlighted and exacerbated the endemic situations and suffering affecting health, migration, economics, and politics. Today, the panelists you're going to hear from will give voice to these endemic situations, and included in these conversations are scholars in the fields of sociology, anthropology, political science from the different Florida universities. We heard this morning from contemporary Puerto Rican artists and from the current exhibition in Constant Storm, and we'll also hear the student perspective from the Florida diaspora this afternoon. We are so grateful to the panelists for sharing so much about their scholarship, to the artists for their artistic practice, and to the student for the student experience. We extend a special heartfelt thanks to Dr. Alessandra Rosa from USF's Sociology Department, who collaborated with us and really got in every aspect of this symposium. And through her scholarship, her goodwill, her enthusiasm, and her vast network of colleagues, helped us assemble this extraordinary symposium and panel. So the symposium this afternoon will be, the afternoon panel's title is called The Politics of Disaster. And I'd like to introduce, without further ado, Noelle Smith. Noelle Smith is a former deputy director of USFCAM, the Contemporary Art Museum. She's the curator of Caribbean and Latin American art, and she's one of the two curators of Constant Storm, Art from Puerto Rico and the Diaspora. Today, Noelle Smith is going to moderate this afternoon's panel. So help me welcome Noelle Smith.
Thank you, Leslie, for that wonderful introduction and introduction to the show. I'd like to reiterate my thanks to you and to Alessandra, our panelists, for participating today. We had a wonderful morning session, so I'm looking forward to more this afternoon. Behind me, the screen shows the entrance to Constant Storm exhibition. And so the work that you see there is by Angel Otero, who's based in New York. And this is called September Elegy. And it's one of only many works that are in this exhibition of just incredible contemporary artists from Puerto Rico and the diaspora. I'm so grateful to them for bringing wonderful works. You saw, if you participated earlier in the morning session, you saw the really extraordinary work that was created by Sofía Gallisá Muriente and Natalia Lassalle-Morillo. So if you get a chance, there's a lot of documentation about the show at usf.cam. And but meanwhile, let's go ahead. Let me introduce our first panel of this afternoon, who is Dr. Fernando Rivera, who will be presenting a presentation called Post-Pre-Maria Health Realities and Political Entanglements. So Dr. Fernando Rivera is a professor of sociology and director of the Puerto Rico Research Hub at the University of Central Florida. He has previously served as interim assistant vice provost for faculty excellence, UCF Global Faculty Fellow, and Provost Faculty Fellow. He has also served in different task forces related to accelerating Latino student success and Hispanic serving institutions. His research interests and activities are in the sociology of health, medical sociology, disasters, and race and ethnicity. His published work has investigated how different mechanisms are related to certain health and mental health outcomes, with a particular emphasis on Latino populations. His disaster research has explored the investigation of factors associated with disaster resilience, restoration and resilience in coupled human natural systems, and climate migration. Other publications have investigated the Puerto Rican diaspora in Florida. He has co-edited Disaster Resilience, Interdisciplinary Perspective, co-authored Disaster Vulnerability, Hazards and Resilient Perspectives from Florida, and edited Emerging Voices in Natural Hazards Research. He was guest editor for a special issue of Population and Environment on Puerto Rico before and after Hurricane Maria. He earned his MA and PhD in sociology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and his BA degree in sociology from the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. He also completed an NIMH-sponsored postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute for Health, Healthcare Policy, and Aging Research at Rutgers University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fernando Rivera.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and hopefully you can see my screen out here. Let me see. There we go. So thank you so much for having me. And first of all, I want to thank the Noelle and Leslie and Alexandra for their invitation to participate here today. One of the things that I really appreciate in terms of the exhibition, kind of like the term of constant storm, I think that's particularly important in looking at that. One of the things that I want to begin with, and let me click out here, is kind of just go back and brief history of some of the issues that we're discussing out here in terms of that. So kind of like the contextual issues of some of the things that happen. And I think for me, sort of the thesis that I'm pushing is that Hurricane Maria serves sort of a reintroduction of the Puerto Rican population here in Central Florida. But kind of like just giving you sort of a contextual type of issues of some of the issues that were happening prior to Hurricane Maria in terms of the economic difficulties that Puerto Rico continues to experience out here in terms of that. And it shows sort of this relationship that we have with the federal government and sort of the financial situation that's still ongoing out here in terms of that. So you can see that way before Hurricane Maria, there was some issues already that were kind of like sort of pushing a lot of Puerto Ricans to consider whether they were going to stay on the island or leave, right? So when we look at the Puerto Rican population movement, one of the things that is happening right now, a lot of people are coming to Florida. And obviously this is for visual representation. It's not necessarily sort of the case out here in terms of that, but it shows that a lot of the movement is happening here in Central Florida. So if you look quickly at the numbers of some of the things that are going on out here, the population trends that we have right now is that we have a decline in population in Puerto Rico and a rising population in the United States. So those numbers continue to arise. We're still getting some numbers from the US Census, but as you can see, you know, there's a disparity between Puerto Rico and the continental United States in terms of the growth of the Puerto Rican population. One of the things that I'm going to share with you today is a chapter that is going to be featuring an upcoming collection of essays out here. It's Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, Disaster, Vulnerability and Resiliency. So this is another great resource that is going to be available soon. So you can, you know, if you want to know more about these topics, this is a great collection, very interdisciplinary in looking at some of those issues. So our chapter that we put in this collection was the health of Puerto Ricans before and after Hurricane Maria. So we wanted to see, you know, what were some of the health profile, both before and after Hurricane Maria, and I will explain out here. One of the best things that happened with this work is that I was able to write this with some undergrad students, some of them who were displaced by Hurricane Maria and ended up coming to UCF as part of what Jorge was discussing this morning in terms of the opportunities that we're giving to students after Hurricane Maria to come to Florida universities and benefit from in-state housing. So this is a research question that you can read out here. Again, what was the health issues experienced by Puerto Ricans, both stateside and island side before Hurricane Maria from the period from 2014 to 2017. Now, just doing some of the sources where we got this information. Obviously, this is pre-Maria, but you can start seeing some of the health issues that we identify out here. issues, a lot of issues with mental health, suicide, anxiety and mood disorders, depression, diabetes, hypertension, respiratory and cardiovascular conditions. And if you recall the emphasis on the Zika virus that was ongoing before Hurricane Maria, that was a real public health threat out here. Inclusively, we've looked, one of the things that we looked in stateside Puerto Ricans is comparing their health status with other Latino, Hispanic, Latinx groups out here. And unfortunately, Puerto Ricans have an unfavorable sort of health status out here. When you compare that to other groups, you know, the majority of the reports and studies that we identify, they show that Puerto Ricans, when compared to other groups, do have worse health than other groups out here. And again, some of the issues that we saw sort of in Puerto Rico also happen here stateside. So diabetes, hypertension, bronchitis, higher body mass index, asthma, anxiety, and mood disorders out here, which is some of the features. So this was prior to Hurricane Maria. When we look at Hurricane Maria, we see some of the issues that happen out here, especially in the healthcare level in terms of the facilities. And remember, you know, a lot of the issues of that economic breakdown that I was talking about before, it was that there was what you could say, there wasn't more funds spent on healthcare systems, and we're going to get into that. But these were the conditions that physicians and health providers had to deal with, right? You know, so we had the issue of transportation, electricity, all those type of things. And, you know, like Jorge in his presentation this morning resembled, a lot of that first wave of people that came after Hurricane Maria were the ones that had these chronic diseases out here, where they couldn't find the services. So it was a life and death situation for them because they couldn't find the resources back in Puerto Rico, particularly at the beginning of the storm out here. Obviously, we know that it has profound consequences in Puerto Rico, from what first was called, you know, 64 deaths, we're doing okay, to eventually the official sort of death count, which is about 3,000, and still, you know, there's indications that that might have been a little bit higher out here as a result of all these cascading situations out here. As you can see, some of the sources out here in terms of the post-disaster or post-Maria type of issues out here. So we kind of like look at some of the issues out here. Obviously, we talked about the death toll. We talked about some of the issues that hospitals, pharmacies were doing, kind of like the issue of disaster medicine, but people that were suffering from chronic disease, right? Oncology centers, you know, we know that after Hurricane Maria, the lack of electricity, a lot of people had to use generators. And there was indication that the air quality after Hurricane Maria was really bad. So if you were suffering from asthma or some chronic respiratory systems, you know, this exacerbated some of your health issues. And obviously the issue of suicides as well was increasing out there. And we see that, you know, that trauma did transfer over to some of the things that we were talking about this morning and Alexandra's work in terms of, you know, kind of like that's post-traumatic stress disorder, those traumatic experiences that a lot of people have still are dealing with to this day. So with all that, right? So that's sort of the pre-post Maria health realities, right? And it's a constant type of issue, but what is the impact? What does this mean for the population here in Central Florida? And we start seeing some of these issues out here. So now we're getting into sort of those political entanglements sort of suggested in the title. One of the things is that there's been a huge impact in higher education locally at the University of Central Florida in 2019. The university receives a designation of Hispanic serving institution. Basically 25% or more of our student body comes from a Latino, Latinx, Hispanic background. And you can see that a lot of growth in that population was due to the increase of the Puerto Rican population here in Central Florida. I have to admit some of the things, you know, I had been pushing for a while to study this population. This has been ongoing for a while, but this reintroduction of the Puerto Rican population, when we had students coming here, when we had parents coming here, when we had people coming here, literally knocking on our doors in ways to help, that erased some of the sort of hesitation of whether we needed to dedicate a space just specifically for Puerto Ricans. So in the summer of 2018, we started the Puerto Rico Research Hub. I'm the founding director. You can find more information sort of at the link out here. But we continue to strive to do that. And this sort of is a direct consequence of the impact of Hurricane Maria here in our area. And right now there's similar type of issues. FIU, Mauricio Ferrer and the foundation are opening sort of those spaces also to have a similar effort going on in Miami as well and in South Florida. In terms of higher education, I'm very pleased and I'm looking forward to visiting the exhibition in person, but there's similar efforts also kind of like at Rollins College, we have a current exhibition as well. So this is sort of the partnership aspect of it, but more and more these spaces, the art spaces are opening up to this experience of Puerto Rican artists out here. So we can see, you know, in the Rollins Museum of Art, you know, if you look at, you know, Antonio Mortorell, some of the exhibitions that have been going on out here, and a lot of them related to Hurricane Maria as well. When we look at sort of politics, right, well, what has been the impact out here? So we see there's more representation in the Florida State House and in the Senate, even locally in the Orange Counties, you can see, you know, a lot of representation are here, the commissioners that constitute the Board of County Commissioners in Orange County. We see also in Orlando and Kissimmee, we have a mayor that is Puerto Rican. If you look at, you know, we have a sheriff that is Puerto Rican. We have an Orange County Public School, as well as school board member, Joanna Lopez as well. So we see that more and more Puerto Ricans and those that have Puerto Rican heritage are occupying those spaces. You know, going back to the election in 2020, the days up to the election, there was a lot of emphasis on Puerto Rico. I'm basically talking about the response of the hurricane, and basically it became a campaign issue out here in terms of that. So all of a sudden, you know, the response from Hurricane Maria, what happened out here in Central Florida, sort of became a center, one of the main issues, at least for the Puerto Rican population here in Central Florida. And I clearly recall in one of the local papers that just maybe 1 week before the election, Puerto Rico was viewed as one of the major campaign topics out here. And we saw that both campaigns did do the outreach to try to come here to Central Florida and get the Puerto Rican vote out here. In some of the things in some of this relationship of Puerto Rico also, if you don't know, Puerto Rico is a Commonwealth of the United States, which falls under the territories. There's been a lot of discussion. The number one question I get from people when I discuss Puerto Rico is why Puerto Rico is not a state. And usually that's what captures the imagination of people. So there's been a lot of push to do that. So local representatives have been pushing for, you know, projects of the law. Hey, let's admit Puerto Rico as a state, let's vote on it. But as we know, the political process in the federal process is not necessarily Puerto Rico, you know, sometimes, well, most of the time it's not the priority for this. But it's interesting enough when I highlighted the names out here, that there was support from the Florida delegations out here in terms of the congressional delegations out here. And I know why. You know, we've done some research on the Puerto Rican Florida population, and there's overwhelming support for Puerto Rico to become a state out here. But this rounds counter to other previous pockets of Puerto Ricans as well. And we see that there's been an opposition to this project. So we have a competing project out here that says like, look, we cannot move only to statehood, but we have to look at all their alternatives as well. At the end of the day, it doesn't seem that any of the projects are going to move on in the immediate future. There's other type of things that are going on currently in Congress and not necessarily. So it continues out here. And it's always kind of like this ongoing discussion that has been going on for decades now in terms of that. one of the things, so we're still bregando. We're still dealing with some of the issues out here in terms of that. In Puerto Rico, there's a push, you know, that Jorge was mentioning this morning, you know, in terms of the party and federal support. You know, still we have issues with Medicaid and other type of health resources, you know, even with SNAP benefits, all those type of things. We still know that there's a fragile healthcare system. There's been a documented exodus of specialists in Puerto Rico. So that's very concerning because all those chronic conditions that we found Puerto Rico suffers from, but also sort of the idea that almost 25% of the population or around that range are age 65 or older. So this is a population that needs critical thing. I'm running out of time, but really quickly, you know, one of the issues with COVID-19, Puerto Rico, you know, has beaten the odds, you know, in terms of resiliency, in terms of here. And when you look at vaccination type of levels and the number of deaths and the transmission, they have been kept under control out here. So this is an interesting dynamic in terms of COVID-19 and all the things that are going on, but still unreliable electric grid. There was a protest in front of the governor's house just yesterday because Puerto Rico still doesn't have reliable electricity system here. We talk about the population decline as well. You know, for the diaspora, especially here in Florida, you know, we have this potential political power. You know, there's some incursion in local politics, but we can see, you know, can that translate into a better outcome for our communities? And, you know, some of the issues that Alessandra and her research team was saying today in terms of integration, also the issue of climate migration continues to be. I think there's some debate in terms of looking at that. Also the issue of language, and also how do we start this bridge with Puerto Rico when we see that there's a lot of businesses that are established both here and on the island. So there's a lot of room for discussion in terms of how do we still keep dealing with these issues out here. So with that, I'm going to stop here to be considerate of time, and I look forward to your questions and your comments.
Thank you so much. I'm very interested to learn about the exhibition at Rollins, which I didn't know about. So thank you for sharing that with us, and I'm going to look into that. Okay, our next panelist is Carlos A. Suárez, and he will be talking about Puerto Rico's disaster, a contested brand. So Carlos A. Suárez is a senior lecturer and director of Master and Graduate Certificate in Latin American Studies at the Center for Latin American Studies. He has a joint appointment with the Department of Political Science and is an affiliate faculty member of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Florida. He holds a PhD and MA in political science from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a BA in political science from the Universidad de Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. His primary teaching and research interests are in urban politics, gated communities, city marketing, branding, and urban politics in Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, and Latin America. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Carlos Suárez.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Noelle. Thank you also, Leslie, Alessandra, and USF for making this possible. What I would like to continue in the same vein as Dr. Rivera's presentation is to address some political elements out of the process that Puerto Rico has seen in the past roughly, I will take it back to 2 decades. So I will be sharing with you what is my presentation with the hopes that I will add to the conversation. And as usual, I'll be happy to field any questions if so at the end. So very well, I hope that it's coming through and it's working out fine. So basically, branding is crucial to the conversation I would like to put forward today. As you can see on the screen, branding has been studied And some of the particular elements or key aspects of branding have to do with basically a coordinated by public-private partnerships, and they're neatly tied to government efforts. So when I'm addressing branding here, it's the political saliency out of the branding experience. And Puerto Rico has seen plenty of that, and my presentation today will highlight some of those features. Very well, so let me continue. Now, reasons why cities have become brands. And I've tried to summarize some of what the literature has argued. We see most of that post-1970s, transition to a more post-Fordist neoliberal policy, greater fluidity of capital. So you have cities competing for investment, et cetera. And then, for example, the emblematic cases, I Love New York, was a result of those efforts back in the 70s. Also, what I bring from Andre Gore's, the rise of the immaterial, how you have these elements that are immaterial, such as a brand, but yet they carry significant importance in the past decades. And certainly cities are vying for generating that type of immaterial product. And also public-private partnerships that have been also more frequent in Puerto Rico have been quite friendly to the notion of city branding. Now, my research that I've been conducting for a number of years now starts with the interest of how Puerto Rican municipalities have branded. And I'm making the distinction between cities who have branded to what historically has been known in Puerto Rico as cognomentos. I'm making a distinction here about explicit branding. My work addressed the case of Guaynabo, how during the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century, a municipal model of branding emerged, making use of the English language aggressively and trying to what I call a process of municipal gentrification, right? The idea of bringing higher income residents to the municipality. We have seen other efforts at branding, and many of them are accompanied with gentrification purposes. Dorado would be an example of that, a high-end municipality, coastal municipality that attracts both Puerto Ricans and people from abroad. There are also more funny examples as Antigua trying to showcase that they have as many people as they have cows. They're a large producer of milk in Puerto Rico. Now, my argument is that branding in Puerto Rico has a real value that's symbolic and material. The material component would be the idea of bringing more investment, more real estate interest to a particular municipality. So different municipalities in Puerto Rico have found ways, or have attempted at least, to brand themselves in some capacity. In 1991, with the lay of the Municipios Autónomos, municipalities had greater agency as to how to pursue their finances. And that's part of the argument that I've shared in the past. Now, there's a robust literature that political science, to be frank, does not address as frequently, but the idea of country branding, or what's called in Spanish, marca país. Puerto Rico has also embarked on many of these experiences for the last 20 years. Many of you will recall the campaign of Puerto Rico Does It Better. Also, during the Alejandro Garcia administration, Puerto Rico is la estrella, branding at the beach where tourists go, etc. Now, there's an element that brought a different sense to the conversation, which was the generation of a DMO. And this happened in 2017 under the former Governor Ricardo Rosselló. Here you see a quote of what were some of the objectives of this corporation. This would be a clear example of both private and public interest joining forces with the efforts of branding Puerto Rico, not only on the island, but abroad. What critics of this Act 17 have argued, I've summarized it here quickly. It's highly politicized, it's not adequate for the task ahead. It was closely linked to the former governor's principal ad agency. So the apolitical nature of this branding, even though it's portrayed, my argument is that it's highly political. Municipalities, governors in Puerto Rico have had great interest in branding the island. That has been a distinct attribute of many of their efforts. Now, Maria has been fairly documented and what it meant for Puerto Rico. A lot of scholarship has happened and will continue. But what I would like to bring forward is the following when it comes to the issue of branding, which is my concern today. I had the chance to share roughly 3 weeks after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, as you can see from the title, that I was personally concerned of the idea that a devastated Puerto Rico would become part of the brand, right? That this significant hardship would somehow be used to put together a branding story regarding Puerto Rico. That was my concern. And as months unfolded, things should be noted. Puerto Rico was already part of the Rockefeller 100 resilient cities before Maria, right? So this language of resiliency at least was present in San Juan, as San Juan was one of those cities of the 100 resilient cities program. Now, arguments that are highly political in nature have been raised against resiliency, stressing particularly that it's an innocuous label that could potentially justify controversial actions. If I were to speak colloquially, somewhat of an amoeba. We don't know exactly what we're dealing with. Now, public-private partnerships have been significant in many of these efforts of generating these cities as sites for commodities, right? That can be used. Now, in the case of Puerto Rico, we started to see what? We started to see different efforts to argue that Puerto Rico was moving past Hurricane Maria. And we saw a concerted effort, and the DMO, to be precise, was instrumental in making this possible. So now you have this public-private partnership joining forces to say to the world, look how Puerto Rico is bouncing back. And that language of resiliency was being picked up for those purposes. For example, the hashtag Cover the Progress was put forward from SOS, we need water and food, to welcome back in a joyous, cheering community with more vegetation and cleaner sidewalks, right? So this idea of Puerto Rico is bouncing back was used after Hurricane Maria. Now, that DMO, that novel public-private partnership, developed a new logo, a new image, which is the one I'm sharing with you, that happened in 2019. And then tourism efforts were split up between island tourism managed by the Board of Tourism, and then out of the island tourism efforts promoted by this DMO. Now, here's a quote from one of the leading figures of the DMO at that time. And there was this language, as you can see on the screen, of pivoting from open to business to Puerto Rico is thriving. So this language was being used with great intent by the different DMO efforts on the island. Now, I would like to note the following. There are a number of political challenges that come with branding. And some of those are summarized here. The idea that public interest is some sort of commodity that can be shaped by experts in media and marketing. It's entrepreneurial in nature, and it makes us wonder how much of the public's input is part of these branding efforts, right? Is it a top-down approach, or you have the public being voiced through these efforts? Many of these decisions are made by quote unquote experts, and it's not in that sense that democratic. Now, aspects that I would like to highlight, and let me actually go back here for a second. When we have this conversation regarding Puerto Rico, is the following when it comes to political challenges. You have a process where, while the notion of brand of Puerto Rico was being put forward, and Puerto Rico was pivoting away from disaster, right? The branding efforts in Puerto Rico were concerted, trying to run away from disaster. What we start to see then is that in academia, you have now significant scholarship being produced under the banner of disaster. And then you have a really curious phenomenon. And what I would like to hypothesize here is the following. As many of you who are familiar with Puerto Rican politics, and Dr. Rivera spoke a little bit on this effect, you have a significant debate as to what's Puerto Rico's political future, whether to continue being a Commonwealth, achieve independence, or statehood, right? And many scholars in Puerto Rico have argued that that conversation, what we call the status issue, which are those three potential paths, if you will, are some sort of a vortex or whirlpool that takes away significant political debate. And most of the debate is framed around issues of the status question. The question that I have now, pardon the redundancy, is the following. With our growing literature on disaster, it's fascinating to see that scholarship has embraced what the city and the country branders did not want to do, which is this notion of addressing disaster. And this is the question that I have, and maybe the Q&A we'll get to talk a little bit about this, is will Puerto Rican scholarship continue to have disaster as its last name from now on until perpetuity, and it will become something similar to the status question when we discuss political situations in Puerto Rico? The three potential paths are always part of the mix. And then I wonder, in the case of Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico scholarship, right, whether diasporic or on the island, is how much of future research will have that disaster attached to it, which is precisely what the branders, who have a different set of purposes, right, than scholarship and academia have, tried to run away from. So that's a significant aspect that I would like to highlight. And it's not only a political challenge, but I propose it as an invitation for people who think on Puerto Rico, including myself. When will the disaster stop, right? Or will we have this body of literature on disaster span for generations, as the status question has in Puerto Rico? And that's a question that evidently I don't have the answer. But I'm very curious about that turn in the literature, because it's precisely what these city branders and this country branders did not want to do. So that's, if you will, a significant aspect that I would like to raise as we push the conversation forward. Will we transcend that disaster, or is disaster to stay? And will disaster be the lens by which we'll be understanding Puerto Rican reality from now on, similar to what the status question has been, particularly with all other generations in the past? So basically, as I try to wrap up my presentation here, there's some elements I would like to emphasize. Place branding is increasingly more important in the articulation and implementation of public policy. The type of branding I'm talking about is a public-private collaboration, neoliberal in nature, responding to interests of late capitalism, that hope to what? To give a different face as to what's the role of the state. Here you have private interests openly articulating many of these efforts. It's not exclusive to Puerto Rico, right? And we see this and other examples in other parts of the world. And then to wrap up, which is the point that I made minutes ago, is that disaster has become part of that narrative that for the most part academics have used to describe Puerto Rico post-Maria, while branding experts are doing the opposite on the island. And my question, out of curiosity with in the years to come is if this disaster literature will become a moment in time fixed and eventually it will end, or will disaster become a fixture of academic production? So having said this, I would like to conclude here, and hopefully I'm within the margins of the allowed time. Thank you.
You did great with time. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I'd like to remind people, I forgot to say this earlier, but we will be taking questions after this next final presentation. So you can enter your questions on chat or on the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer them. So our final presentation today is, we'll be hearing a student's voice, very, very important. Nicole Delgado-Vélez will give a presentation titled Growing Up in the Diaspora. So Nicole Delgado-Vélez is a junior at the University of South Florida campus, on the Tampa campus, studying integrated public relations and advertising and international studies. She is originally from San Juan, Puerto Rico, and now lives in Tampa. She's currently the president of the Boricua Student Association and has been a member since the fall of 2019. She is organized and coordinating cultural events on campus and is currently working with an elementary school in Tampa for a cultural presentation. Nicole has also volunteered with El Comeback, a project by Puerto Rican nonprofit Comprometidos to help bring Puerto Ricans of the diaspora back to the island. So welcome, Nicole.
Hello, thank you so much. I think, Leslie, if you could please screen share my presentation. All right, thank you so much. So, hi everybody, my name is Nicole Delgado-Vélez. I'm a junior, as you just heard. Next slide, please. This is growing up in the diaspora. A little bit about me before we actually get into it. I'm 20 years old, originally from San Juan, Puerto Rico, native fluency in Spanish and English. My immediate family moved to Lakeland, Florida on July 4th of 2004. I'm a junior at USF with studying integrated public relations and advertising for pre-law, and Puerto Rico is the only place that I've ever truly considered home. Next, please. So my story, December 17th, 2000, a star is born. That's me. I try not to take myself too seriously. So again, July 4th, 2004, I know quite the date to move to the main US. We moved to Lakeland, Florida. My family started from nothing when we came over here. And actually I noticed with Natalia and Sofia's presentation earlier on in the morning, Disney as a driving force of Puerto Rican migration. Coincidentally, my dad's first job in Florida was actually at Disney in Orlando. And two of my cousins that also came in the diaspora also had jobs at Disney in order to like set up their lives in the mainland United States. I want to go over a little bit of reasons why people have to leave Puerto Rico, in addition to the issues that were previously brought up in other presentations. Number one is just better overall quality of life in terms of like medical care, infrastructure, safety. All of these things were big factors for my family in particular, especially medically. I was born anemic and I had a couple other health issues as a kid that the medical system in Puerto Rico just like couldn't handle. Growing up over there, if you want like a medical appointment, you have to take the entire day off for a 2-hour appointment, something that over here you could do in a lunch break. It's just, the system is very slowed down. Next slide, please. So growing up outside of Puerto Rico, I was always, this is Lakeland, Florida, is Polk County. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but I went to a school called Resurrection Catholic. And I was one of the few minority kids in my classes. I went to school from when I was 4 years old all the way to high school with the same kind of group of people. Spanish was a favorite class, obviously, because I did very well in it. But I wanted to go over some of the conflicts that are kind of faced by, you know, especially younger people in the diaspora, whether they're from Puerto Rico, Colombia, other places. Growing up in an area that is majority Caucasian, especially with classmates that don't really look like you, you don't feel the same representation. I was forced to kind of go through some things that I don't think anybody should. It's not as bad as other people, but in high school, I was told I smelled like rice and beans. And there were a couple times that I was called a couple slurs. I don't say this to like kind of bring down the mood, but I think it's important to consider that diaspora Puerto Ricans are still Puerto Ricans. Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because I, along with other Puerto Ricans that maybe weren't born on the island, we face a lot of identity and almost an identity crisis of you're Puerto Rican, but you don't live there. So like, are you truly Puerto Rican? I would say I am Puerto Rican. The fact that I still celebrate my culture being outside of the island makes me just as Puerto Rican as anybody else that actually went to school directly on the island. Next slide, please. So an impact of the diaspora. Imposter syndrome is the third point. I'll get to that in a second. Side effects include not seeing much of your family and getting creative when you can't see your family. So if you see the first image, I printed out a picture of my brother and stuck it to a popsicle because he couldn't make it for Christmas. And the two pictures on the right are with a family friend. I would consider him an uncle. I hadn't seen him in years, but the diaspora really impacts your like social familial relations. And I just think that it's something that doesn't get talked about enough, kind of just that strain that it puts on relationships. Next slide, please. So in my time at USF, I joined the Boricua Student Association on the fall of 2019. That was my freshman year. Next slide, please. So joining BSA was the best decision that I've made in my college career. That joining BSA was the first time that I ever felt truly comfortable with my identity in a social setting outside of my family, outside of some close friends. I actually felt like I had people who had my back, who identified with me, who were also from the island, who also went through some of the same struggles that I did going to school outside of the island. It was the best decision I've made because not only we engage with our community, but we also are there for each other and are a support system because we know what the others have gone through as well. Next slide, please. And so in 2020, we all know the big thing that happened, the event that shall not be named. That was the first year that I became president of the Boricua Student Association. And I kind of wanted to show a little bit of what we've managed to accomplish given the circumstances. And kind of going off of the topic of resiliency mentioned in the previous presentation, I think that BSA has also been really resilient given all the circumstances. So Leslie, if you could just play the first part of that video. This was a submission that we had for a cultural fair. It's a video about Puerto Rican recipes.
Sale loco de contento con su cargamento para la ciudad. Ay, para la ciudad. Lleva en su pensamiento todo un mundo lleno de felicidad, ay, de felicidad. Piensa remediar la situación del hogar que estoy.
And then the next video is like our introduction. Just, this was a way for us to connect with our members, for them to have an idea of who was running all the virtual events, who BSA is, the people that make it up. So if you could please press play.
That's how we do it with the new blood skills. Toda la mano para arriba, muévelo, con todo el flow en el aire, muévelo, aquí todo el mundo vacila, muévelo, no vamos a parar, rompemos la fiesta, muévelo, somos la candela, muévelo, disculpe señor oficial, muévelo, hoy vamos a rumbear, esto es tan duro, esto no está easy, en la discoteca hay un apocalipsis, el booty que tú tienes, baby, es un alma, con la nena ready, Nicky ya apretó la alarma, pa' que baje, prueba este veneno que te traje, tengo pa' llenarte ese garaje, a tu cuerpo le hago un homenaje, DJ suénalo, pégalo, que hasta abajo, vámonos, el flow no le baje, que este ritmo suena cómodo, suénalo, pégalo, que hasta abajo, vámonos, no le bajes nada, toda la mano para arriba, muévelo, con todo el flow en el aire, muévelo, aquí todo el mundo vacila, muévelo, no vamos a parar, rompemos la fiesta, muévelo, somos la candela, muévelo, disculpe señor oficial, muévelo, hoy vamos a rumbear, mami síguelo, no me tranco, rebótate esa nalga como si fuera un cheque en blanco, quédate con el club, meneando todo ese plástico, tiro para atrás, yo te guayo en piloto automático inquieta, tú no eres un mueble, pa' mí tú eres coqueta,
Oh, thank you so much. Sorry. Okay. And then something else I wanted to address that BSA has done in the pandemic. As you can see on the far right, we have a flan de vainilla kind of post. That's from our Instagram. If you go follow it, Boricuas_USF on Instagram. Another way that we were interacting was we did some cooking lives where we kind of shared our recipes. That's actually my recipe, so try it out. Let me know what you think about it. And then that second picture of El Comeback is a partnership that we began in the pandemic, but we're still developing currently. So next slide, please. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about Comprometidos, which is a nonprofit that I have done some work with ever since, I want to say October of this past year. So it's about to be 1 year since that. Comprometidos' mission is to provide local businesses with grants to help lift the economy and like aid in a self-sufficient Puerto Rico. So they do a lot of this through not just grants, but also providing like volunteers and just overall aid to the local economy. They talk to local farmers, coffee growers. They're a very good nonprofit. Next slide, please. So El Comeback is an initiative done by Comprometidos, and that is the project that I was mainly working on. I was helping with some social media management, with some outreach. And the goal is basically to be able to bring Puerto Ricans of the diaspora back to the island and keeping Puerto Ricans that would go into the diaspora from leaving the island. So for many, just the lack of opportunities is reason enough to leave the island. But recently, especially in San Juan, there's been a growing tech sector. And so what Comprometidos does, what El Comeback does, is it connects people looking for jobs in Puerto Rico with the companies that are hiring. So you would go on the website, you would click start your registration, submit your resume, and then they connect you with companies that would match and fit your abilities and skills. And that to me is something that is very, very near and dear to my heart, because as I said, Puerto Rico is the one true place that I felt like my heart is happy, but the lack of opportunities can make it difficult for me and others like me to be able to be in that space where we truly feel ourselves. So I put the link to El Comeback in the presentation, elcomebackpr.org. If you'd like to check it out or find out more information, there's some videos on their page that are also very informative and very helpful. And with that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nicole. It's very inspiring to hear what you and other students are doing. It's truly the future. And you made me hungry. I love those videos, especially the one with everyone wrapping yourselves in the Puerto Rican flag. I think is wonderful. Do we have time for questions? We are at 3:17. What do you think, Leslie?
Yeah, this session goes until 3:30, so we do.
Oh, excellent. All right, so let me ask, I don't really have any questions in the chat. So let me first, I do have a question, but first I'd like to know if any of you panelists would like to discuss anything in particular about the other presentations or etc. No? Okay.
Well, I'll take a step to try to answer Carlos' question, whether disaster might change a thing. It might be not disaster per se, but the reconstruction funds. I still get kind of like that idea that the funds of reconstruction are sort of the attraction to the island, right? That is related to disaster. So that's kind of like my observation in trying to attempt to answer your very interesting and also very complicated question.
You mean CDBG funds in particular?
All type of funds, right? FEMA, okay. All that type of stuff out here. And I've seen, more and more in the rhetoric is like, come to Puerto Rico because there's all this funding going on. We're going to have contracts. We're going to have all those type of things. And now that the money is actually being released, which is another aspect of it, right? That it's taking quite some time to get some of the funds released. Just reading the newspaper and back in Puerto Rico, there's about 70 bridges that need reconstruction urgently, and they haven't even attempted to do that, and they're signing the contract. So perhaps it might switch, not necessarily disaster, but reconstruction funds. And I think the issue of climate change might be another topic as well.
Yeah, and what I found curious, and if anyone has questions, I'll stop, but if not, I'll keep engaging in the conversation. It's that my curiosity is if whether disaster or reconstruction, right? You're pointing to that, if that will become something to the extent that status question has been in Puerto Rico for the past 100+ years, right? This element that sucks life out of any alternatives or any political debate or conversation, right? And I'm certainly aware that there are people in the diaspora and on the island that when they engage Puerto Rico, they go beyond that, for lack of a better term, paradigm. But I was curious to see if disaster will be something that replaces that, as some people have started to argue and ascribe to this notion that the old political cleavage of statehood, independence, Commonwealth is starting to shift in Puerto Rico, I think. We're seeing new political parties that do not necessarily ascribe to either view. So that would be something interesting to be on the lookout in the coming years.
Okay. I'll ask my question, and this is for Fernando, but Carlos may also be able to answer. Fernando, I was interested in your sort of very comprehensive list of stressors on health in Puerto Rico. And I want to connect that to, I don't know if you saw an article that came out in the New York Times today about food sustainability in Puerto Rico. And it's really interesting article. I'll mention the writers by Israel Melendez Ayala and Alicia Kennedy. And they talk about the fact that over 80% of the food in Puerto Rico is imported, and that it's very, very difficult to get local food and to get fresh food. And they talk about the Jones Act as being a main culprit for this. So number one, Fernando, how would you rate food availability and healthful food in your list of health stressors? And do you agree that, what do you think about the culpability of the Jones Act? And maybe people would like to know a little bit more about the Jones Act.
Yeah, so good question. I did read the article that you're referring to early in the morning out here. So obviously, I mean, I think the Jones Act is one of those consequential aspects of discussion of Puerto Rico, right? Especially here with Florida, right? So if people don't know, there's since 1917 or so, there's the law says that anything that you import to Puerto Rico has to be through a USA vessel. So that benefits the maritime and the shipping industry of the United States, which impacts here directly because one of the principal ports of suppliers is Jacksonville. So that brings about an interesting conversation. Obviously, we saw what could be the significant consequences of not having functional ports and not having access to food, especially those first 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria, where there was a lot of desperation because food wasn't getting into the island because everything got disrupted out here. So we're kind of like seeing all sort of things. And, you know, kind of like to the article, they were saying, you know, there's this sort of reemergence of agricultural activity, particularly surrounding young people, and sort of the, you know, and this is related to some of the things, right? You know, preventative sort of health issues out here that we often don't discuss, right? It's sort of for both for Puerto Rico and even for the United States, we have abundance of food, but it's bad food, right? And then we are concerned why we have all these chronic health diseases, right? That are highly preventable in terms of that. At least in some contexts, in the continental context, people have more options. You know, when you're on an island that most of it is imported, there's socioeconomic sort of restrictions. You know, it makes it very difficult to do so. So there's kind of like that level of social inequality in terms of that, who can benefit from this certain type of economic conditions when there are restrictions in terms of trade, in terms of, you know, protections that are put to U.S. farmers against, you know, Puerto Rican farmers and sort of that industry. So it's sort of another example of this constant storm, right? Of how the issues of past policies, federal policies, local policies, does impact the economy, does impact the health, and does impact also the stress of people in terms of that, right? So it's an interesting intersection of the different issues that Puerto Rico as a territory has to deal with. I don't know if Carlos or Nicole, you want to add anything else?
The only thing that I would agree with what Dr. Rivera just said, but the only thing that I would add is whether younger generations and this movement, as some even have called neojibaros, this notion of they tend to be well-educated people going back to the land and the farm-to-table movement. How much of that will make inroads on the island? My concern is whether it will be a niche dynamic that people who have middle to upper class means can access to, but it's not widely available to most Puerto Ricans, right? It could be the spear, the tip to a larger process, and I think that's welcome. But I wonder, and then for good or bad, these type of movements are happening on their own without significant governmental support. maybe that's the way to go. I don't know, but that's a debate we could certainly have. Whether if we have a government policy behind it, would that enhance their possibilities or strike it down? So in that sense, I don't have a definite answer, but certainly my concern is whether it will remain being a niche that is only accessible to some Puerto Ricans, and then the more chronic issues that Dr. Rivera has pointed out will continue. That's my concern, right?
Thank you both. That's very clarifying. Does anybody else have any questions? Anything else they would like to add to the discussion? Well, I would like to remind everyone that the exhibition Constant Storm is up at USF Contemporary Art Museum until December 4th. If you are in Tampa on November 19th, we will be having a closing celebration at the museum at USF. We weren't able to have an opening for obvious reasons, but we hope we can do a closing. And we hope to be bringing some artists back, Miguel Luciano, probably Wanda from Raimundo Ortiz from UCF, and perhaps some others. So that's all I have to say, except I have so enjoyed this presentation and the presentation this morning. And I'm very, very appreciative of what you brought to this conversation. So thank you. And
thank you so much. And I will say, Nicole, our door is open. If anything that we can do to help, just let us know as well. So thank you so much.
Come visit. Let us know.
I will. Yes, absolutely.
I'll give you a tour.
Yes, absolutely.
That refers to everybody. Come visit the museum. I'll give you a tour. Leslie?
Yes, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us on a Saturday, and I have loved every minute of this. It was fascinating. I learned so much from this morning and this afternoon to give a broader picture and a different kind of voice to the exhibition. It has been really amazing. And Nicole, it was wonderful to hear from you and your experience growing up in this situation as a young person. And yeah, you're the future. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so very, very, very much.
And thank you, Mark, for all your technical assistance. We couldn't do it without you.
That was my last part I was going to say and totally forgot. So thank you to Mark Fredericks. He is the engine behind all of our technology back there, and to Don Fuller and Marty De La Cruz, who did the graphics, and to the staff at CAM who just made this exhibition happen. It is truly a group effort. When you walk into the museum, it seems quiet and very organized, but it is an enormous engine behind that to make it work. So thank you to everybody at CAM.
Absolutely.
Thank you all.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.